All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining our webinar today that we are calling Robots in Your Business Process, or How Intelligent Automation Can Improve Your Business Processes. And so the first thing that I would like to do is just sort of introduce our panelists that we are going to have today. But before I do that, I would just like to mention that we have a question and answer panel. So as we're going through, and if you have any questions that you would like to ask of the panelists, feel free to ask them there, and I'll do my best to kind of get to them as we are going through the presentation. But if not, we'll have some time set aside at the end to answer some of your questions. But jumping into it, so today's panelists, I'll introduce myself. So my name is Colin Schoenfelder. I am the Director of Technology at Macedon, and I oversee our emerging technologies as well as the in-house solution development. So, RPA and UiPath definitely fall under there. And with me, I have Nick, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. My name is Nick Frederick. I'm a portfolio manager here at Macedon. And for the specifics of this webinar today, I'm also the UiPath Stream product owner. And so I help kind of select the automations that we're going to go and build and work with the business and the development team to make sure that we successfully build those automations.
Great. And then Megan, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. My name is Megan Morkert. I'm a project leader here at Macedon. I've been acting as the UiPath Stream leader, and so I've been working closely with Nick in terms of deciding which automations we want to develop, and then working with our development team to actually get those developed out.
Great. Thank you very much. And so kind of like this we have done in the previous webinars, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction about who we are at Macedon and kind of give some context about how we arrived at this topic. So at Macedon, we are practitioners that specialize in intelligent automation. And over the course of the 10 years that we have been working, we have done work for over 100 clients and 450 engagements. Certainly across that time, we have seen a lot of evolution in the different technologies that we work with. Appian is something that we have been using for a low-code application builder for a long time. And over the course of the last few years, we've really seen an explosion in RPA as a technology, which we've had a lot of questions and a lot of engagements, just sort of investigating with. And more specifically with UiPath, we have seen that as, really the, technology leader from the RPA perspective. And we've been investing a lot into ramping up our own certifications and ability to deliver in those products. And actually recently we just got certified as a gold partner, which has been pretty exciting for us. But one of the things that has really allowed us to be successful with our Appian product and Appian development is the fact that we're really big on drinking our own homebrew. And so we build all of our own applications in-house in order to manage our own business. Through doing that, we get to really get an opportunity to hone our delivery methodologies, make sure that we're using that as a test bed in order to figure out what is going to be successful in terms of delivery on projects, hone our own best practices and develop best practices that are going to be with, the cutting edge features of Appian as they're coming out. Build different solutions and get an understanding of exactly how we are going to, best apply Appian towards different technologies. And so as, we've been ramping up on UiPath as, a partner, we really felt like it made a lot of sense to do the same thing there. And a lot of questions that we get when we are talking about RPA just generally is, it's something that has been kind of rumored to be the next big technology, but people don't really know how to get started with it. And so we wanted to have a discussion for this webinar to really just talk through exactly how we went through the process of starting up our own UiPath practice, figuring out what our ideas were for automations, and figuring out how we went through that entire delivery process. So hopefully this will be helpful for everybody, but I'll jump right into it. And so first, just kind of with the discussion, I think that it would be helpful for Nick. If you wouldn't mind just kind of defining exactly what an automation is and just setting a little bit of context there before we kind of get into how we actually do the delivery process.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like many businesses, we have a number of tasks that we need to complete to kind of keep the business running smoothly and make sure that all of our ducks are in a row and everything is taken care of. And a good number of those processes are kind of regular tasks that we need to accomplish that are straightforward, but can be tedious or can take up a lot of time. And so when we talk about UiPath automations, it's about offloading, that work onto our UiPath robots and allowing them to kind of tackle these processes that are rule-based, have a set standard number of inputs that are repetitive and need to be done at a particular time. And what it allows us to do, offloading that work frees up our employees to really maximize their productivity and value and allow them to focus on those higher level functions and kind of offload the more repetitive tasks to the robots themselves.
Right. And for sure in that, if you're doing just a lot of manual kind of like copying data from one system to another, it can be really easy to have, false centered data and things. And so, RPA and automations just generally can allow for a lot more consistency in the kinds of, work that we're doing.
Yeah, especially for a lot of these more tedious tasks, it kind of removes the human error and allows the computers and the robots to kind of do what they do best, which is kind of do those repetitive tasks consistently in the same way every time that they execute.
Yeah. And another thing, in traditional BPM and, a lot of the application development, one of the things that kind of sticks out at me as, a little bit of a difference between RPA is that from a BPM perspective, a lot of times, you're coming from the strategic level, you're coming from the high end, trying to look for opportunities to optimize, processes, but that's really something which is coming from strategic and then sort of brought down, and implemented at sort of, the tactical level, where everybody is sort of using the systems that have been engineered kind of from a more global level, and then that has been brought down upon, the people who are doing work. And so, I'm wondering if that's any different for RPA, and can you talk a little bit about like where we source the ideas for RPA and how we kind of, find that value there?
Absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, the more traditional BPM software comes from, a strategic initiative from the executive staff and kind of encompasses, from that top down level. Our RPA automations, come from the employees themselves. So, we source these ideas and these opportunities for automation from the employees themselves for the tasks that they need to complete every day. And so, throughout their workday, they might say, hey, I'm doing this every day or every week. It'd be great if I could offload this and win some hours back to kind of focus on those more high value operations that need to be done.
Right. And so the ideas are actually coming from, the people who are doing the work. So it's a much more bottom up approach, right? So from like the BPM standpoint, you're getting a top down, here's how we think that everything should be orchestrated to be a bit more, streamlined. And then RPA is kind of coming from the bottom up to really give you both sides of, the equation and trying to, enhance and get and deliver, automation. And so I understand that UiPath in particular actually has some tools that they use in order to make that. Would you mind kind of giving us a little bit of a demonstration of what those can look like?
Yes, absolutely.
Pass it over to you.
So, when we first got started with UiPath, we initially kind of stored all of our ideas into one spreadsheet that employees at Macedon would add ideas to. But UiPath actually has a suite of tools that really help optimize this kind of process or this idea generation. And what they call that is UiPath Automation Hub. And so this is actually now the canonical home for all of our automation ideas that we plan or may in the future develop for UiPath automation. And so you can see here that, we've fully embraced Automation Hub. We've got, dozens of ideas of possibilities of things that we would like to build out in automation. And so you can see all these ideas here on the screen. And so an employee would come in and they have access to this Automation Hub. They click Submit Idea. And what that allows them to do is that it runs them through a particular wizard that asks them a number of questions to get the kind of basics or more information about that automation itself. So how rule-based it is, the type of inputs that they can expect to have, the number of exception cases that they could expect in this particular workflow, and all of those kind of build out to a particular score for how viable that idea is to be built in UiPath or with UiPath automation.
Great. And so then when we were going through and trying to figure out from this list, and I know that, myself, I entered a lot of different ideas and we had a lot of different kind of business units that were entering ideas. How did you as the product owner kind of go through and decide which one of those that you actually wanted to execute?
Yeah, so we had a ton of ideas. And so, picking one was actually a relatively difficult task because of the number of them that we had. But UiPath really allowed us to focus on those processes that were, ready and ripe for automation. And so the one that we really kind of stuck our teeth into first is this one called Update Financial Spreadsheets. So go ahead and click into this and give a little background on this. On a weekly basis, our portfolio and delivery managers need to kind of track the financials of each of our client projects. And so, as the week goes on, people enter time into our system, and then that time is then gathered from our system and put into a number of spreadsheets to kind of track the financial life of that particular project. And so this needs to be done, on a weekly basis so that we have, an up-to-date financials for each of these projects. And so you can see here that when this idea was entered and when it was entered into the system, it was asked a number of these questions and it gave us this high-level assessment. And so what that did is these 5 different metrics that are really key to knowing whether or not a process can be automated with UiPath. And so this first one is rules. It's very rule-based. There are do X to get Y, and it's very structured in the way that the actual process is conducted. Furthermore, we have the input type. So for this one, it's very digital. In fact, all the information we get is gathered from a computer screen or from a system on the computer. And so that lends itself to ease of implementation as opposed to scanning in some non-digital information. The quality itself, so the inputs themselves, if they're structured, so all the inputs look exactly the same, it gets another high score, and that's another great reason that we picked this one. The process stability. So we've been doing this process for a pretty long time, and it really hasn't changed too significantly over the lifetime of the process once we kind of figured out how we wanted to manage it. So we know that this process is very unlikely to change because, as you might imagine, processes that change, are hard to automate because you need to then incorporate the UI tools to accommodate those changes. And then the document availability. So are there detailed work instructions about what exactly needs to get done, and there aren't any gaps in the, fleshing out of that process itself.
Great. And so, with those metrics there, and then I can also see that on the right, estimating the number of people that are using this, estimating the number of time saved, it's very concrete, how it can say, this is how much we are actually going to benefit from a very specific ROI metrics, which is something which is, a really cool feature to get to do and really helps to decide, where we are going to place our focus.
Yeah, absolutely. That assessment score on the right here is really kind of where it all gets brought to life. And you can see this little grid here in the top right, knowing that, how easy it is to implement and its possibility for automation is incredibly high. So our automation potential was at 98%. The ease of implementation was at 93%. So this really made it a prime candidate for automation. But there's 2 other statistics that I'd like to kind of point out here that are very valuable as well. The benefit, or the hours saved per year. So it's 382 hours that are given back to our employees to allow them to focus again on those high level operations and maximize the value that they're bringing to the company, as well as, translating that into the full-time equivalent. So it's a 0.2 of a full-time equivalent. So, we're getting a lot of time back when we see this in production, and our portfolio managers are able to focus on, what they're most needed for as well.
Great. And so then, so over to Megan. So, Nick had decided that this is with the automation that we wanted to, kind of move forward first. So once we kind of got it over to your team, can you talk a little bit just about what some of the initial things that you needed to do in order to decide how to tackle this, and sort of how this automation was going to be categorized so that you could kind of break it up?
Sure. So the first thing we really had to think about was what type of automation this would be, if it would be attended or unattended. And let me define those real quick before we continue on. So an attended process is something that we're launching from our own computer, where we might be inputting information, or the automation needs some sort of help from us as a human in some way in order to complete the process. Versus an unattended automation is something that is launching from a dedicated environment. No humans are interacting with it, and it doesn't need any of that additional input to complete that process. So when we were initially deciding which way we wanted to go with the update financial spreadsheets process, we could have said it was attended, but in that case, we would have had every person who needed to update those financial spreadsheets launching that process individually, versus we ended up going with an unattended process, which meant we could schedule this process to kick off automatically once every week, and it would go through and update all of those different financial spreadsheets for everyone all at the same time.
Gotcha. And so in the unattended case, which is how we went with here, it's running on a VM in the background. It's not necessarily running on anybody's individual machine. So you sort of have like, that abstracted layer where it's doing work, but it's not something that anybody has to sort of maintain actively in order to get this to continue moving forward.
Yep, correct.
Great. And so I believe that you have a demonstration for what this automation actually looks like in process for us.
Yes, so I'm going to start us out over here. So this robot financial tracker spreadsheet is the source of truth for our process. And it's where our automation is pulling from to figure out which client contracts are we actually updating. So as you can see here, we have the client and contract names, as well as the spreadsheet URLs that we're updating. And then an error point of contact if something goes wrong with updating that particular sheet.
Cool. So we have financial spreadsheets, which is basically going to track the hours that an employee is entering, and then a list of projects for where we want to scrape the hours from our source system and put them into the spreadsheets.
Yep. And so as an example here, this financial spreadsheet, where we're looking to dump the data that we're pulling is right here in this QBO raw tab. So you can see we have a couple rows here of some dummy employee time, but you can see that it's mainly empty. So kind of moving forward into how we're kicking off this process, this is an unattended process, which means I want to go over to Orchestrator. So Orchestrator is kind of the home base for all of our processes. It's where we can kick off those unattended processes, monitor them while they're running, and then look at logs to see what happened while they were running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off a new process here for our dispatcher. And what that is going to do is it's going to read from this spreadsheet here and then start and pull the information we need and start populating these sheets.
And this is something which normally we could run in the background as sort of a scheduled activity.
Yep. So you can see that completed, and now we are looking at the update financial spreadsheets to start, and you can see it's running. And I just swapped over to the VM. This is the unattended machine where we're running our unattended processes. And you can see it just opened up Appian with our internal system here on our test environment. It logged into Appian and it navigated over to our employee time report. And again, I'm not typing anything. That is the automation that is just typed all that out. What it just did there is it filled in some filters and then downloaded a report. So closing out of that, what we're looking to see then is if I click over to our financial template here, you can see that we just had these 5 rows of data appear here for 1012 to 1016. So for any of the contracts in this list, we would see that data get populated for each of those sheets.
Okay. And so that last part was really interesting because it didn't need to actually go over to the sheet and manually enter things in. So how did it get the information actually into this Google spreadsheet here?
Yep, so in that case, we were able to leverage the G Suite API that UiPath exposes to us. So we were able to, update these sheets using APIs. We didn't have to go and navigate in the front end, and that makes it faster and a little bit safer in terms of, if UIs change in the future with Google, it's a little bit safer to use the APIs there. So it's nice that UiPaths give those to us.
Cool. So that's a really interesting point because that means that, sort of as you're building out these automations, part of the process can be pulling from systems, the same way that you would if you were a user. But when you have the opportunity as part of, the process, you can use traditional integration methods in order to make them more structured.
Yep, so exactly.
So that was a really cool first automation. And so Nick, that one was an example of an unattended automation, but the next one I think that we did was actually an attended automation. Can you give us a little bit of background into like how we decided to use our next automation?
Sure, absolutely. And so, as Megan touched on, the unattended automations are optimally used when there's a set schedule that they need to be run on. So every Monday morning, this automation would run to put in the financial spreadsheet. But there's a ton of other processes that don't necessarily have a set schedule, but still a lot of the process can be automated. And so one of the key things, as a portfolio manager at Macedon, I'm also the one of the program manager for our internal team, which we call the house. And so what we have to do quite often is when client projects wrap up or people leave for other projects, we need to get them onto the house project and get them up and running to contribute to the project or the program as soon as possible. And so to be able to do that, there are a ton of administrative tasks that we need to complete before we can have them up and running. So it means adding them to our project tracker in our Appian software. It means adding them to the spreadsheets to track their, what project they're going to be on within the house program, as well as a number of other systems that they need to be added to, such as Google Groups, to be able to get notifications and added to invites. And once all that's complete, they're set up and ready to develop. And so, the difficulty is that we don't have complete control or predictability of when those projects are going to end any more than, sometime in the past or in the present. And so we need to be able to kick that task off on the day that they are ready to start up on the house. And so that attended process really this process really lends itself to an attended process that can be kicked off, at any time when someone rolls on to the house.
Great. And I do appreciate that as the product owner, I can't help but notice that both of these automations that you have prioritized happen to be things that you are doing on your regular basis. So
yeah. While true, as you saw at Automation Hub, we have a ton of other ideas that certainly will span the entire business, and I believe maximize value across the firm for sure.
Great. And so Megan, I think that was the next one that we had implemented. And so do you have an example of exactly what that one looks like and kind of how it differs from the unattended process in terms of how you would kick it off?
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and share again. So as Nick said, this is an attended process. We have a very similar setup to the unattended process that we just saw previously, where we have this Google Sheet where we're adding our employee names. And so we could add as many employees as we needed to onboard to our internal project here. For the purposes of our demo, we're going to say that Nick needs to onboard me, Megan Markert, onto this project called Blackbird Syrup. And so the unattended processes we kicked off from Orchestrator, or they were scheduled to kick off automatically. For attended processes, we go to this little application called UiPath Assistant. So that's something you install into your computer and that you can download those different automations into Assistant to kick off. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kick off house onboarding. So let me click play.
And so this is listing all of the different automations that you have access to as a user.
Yep.
Gotcha.
All right, so the first thing we're doing here is we're logging into Appian as yourself. So there I logged in as Emily PM. She's one of our test users in our test environment. Were we running this in prod, say Nick was running it, he would be logging in as his own account there. But so what we're doing here is first we want to navigate to the projects that we're onboarding our employees onto, and then going in and adding them as a team member there. And then we went and completed that action, and I've been added as a team member to Blackbird Syrup. After that, we're going over to reports. We're downloading this report so that we can get the employee's title and email for use later on in the process. That way, whoever's kicking this off doesn't have to enter all of that in the sheet that we started off with. So next is here, the sprint capacity sheet. You can see that this row here is blank. What we're doing next is that the process is going to go ahead and update the roll-on date and the stream and roll for those current sprints there. So you can see that now I have a roll-on date for today for Blackbird Syrup. And then finally, the last thing we're doing here is we have opened up Google Groups, and we are looking to add each employee to two different Google Groups. The first one is this UiPath Dev House group, and we're tabbing through, and we check to see if I was already in the group. We can see if we're not. So we are going ahead and adding me to the group. And then we're going to check to see if I should be added to a second group for PLs only. Now, I believe I'm already in this group, so I think it's just going to check to see if I should be added, and then it's going to end for us.
So this example, we have a number of different systems that it's going through. So it starts out with, an Appian application, then it's going off into like a Google Sheets, and then it's going off into a third one for, Google Groups. So in this case, it's really kind of chaining together a number of different systems.
Yep.
As a side note, those Appian systems that you were interacting with at the beginning, those were some really good looking systems. Who was it that, built those Appian applications for you?
Yep, so that was all built by our internal Appian development team.
Shameless plug. I'm very, very proud of those applications that we built in-house. But cool. So that was really cool. And I like also that, it's still taking advantage of sort of that hybrid approach between some of the places where we can use API layers in order to insert data it uses, and some of the places where it can't, where it's a little bit more difficult, it is, adding users to groups through the front end. So that's definitely a really cool example of how that works. And so a couple of things that I wanted to talk through. I did actually see that we have a few questions that have come through. But before I get to the questions, I did want to just kind of talk a little bit about the process. So you had a team that you were working to do development with in order to get the application developed. For the RPA bots and the automation development, can you talk a little bit about how you broke down the development into multiple chunks so that it could be worked on by a couple of different people, and just exactly kind of how that worked with your sort of delivery process?
Sure. So where we started out was with Automation Hub and figuring out, okay, we figured out what idea we wanted to start with. From there, we did a deep dive and figured out what is the current as-is process of how we're doing it manually, what is the desired to-be process when we're automating it, and then what we did from there is broke down the stories into a lot of little bite-sized chunks. So say, creating a story for logging into a system, navigating around, and by doing it in that way with the little bite-sized chunks, we could have multiple developers working on each of those, and we weren't stepping on each other's toes.
Okay, gotcha. So it can work very much like a traditional development, environment. It's not like, somehow with automations you have to kind of like have a custom development environment or setup that you need to use. Can use traditional methodologies.
Yeah.
And additionally, Colin, as the house program manager, we have a number of other streams that are doing development, and the UiPath stream has been able to integrate, their software development process very easily into our, SDLC process itself. So they're working alongside our other Appian development streams and contributing to the code base and the application enhancements at the same time. So it was really cool to have this, relatively different software integrate very well with the, our software delivery lifecycle.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And we're running close to end of time, but we did have a couple of questions come through. So I wanted to go through those. So first question, it's asking about security. So how does UiPath know your password? And can you talk a little bit about the security there? So Megan, I think that it works a little bit differently for unattended versus attended automations. Can you talk about how the security works between those two different paradigms?
Sure. So with the unattended processes, we have created system accounts that are specifically used by our unattended automations. And the credentials for those are stored in Orchestrator in something called an asset. And there's a specific type called credential asset, so that those passwords are masked when you're going into Orchestrator and looking at things that way. Versus for our attended processes, we use the Windows credential store to ask the user for their login information. For example, you saw Appian there. We ask them for their username and password. They give that to us and we store it in Windows credential store, so that's stored locally. It's never sent anywhere into the cloud. And then when we're running those processes later, we can just ask the Windows credential store for that, and we don't have to ask the user every time we're running that process.
Gotcha. Cool. And so in that case, when you have a lot of credentials that are user credentials, especially in the attended case, UiPath is not aware of any of the credentials. It's not storing it. That is all basically your own user management and password management that would be local to any machine.
Yep, correct.
Cool. All right. The second question that came through, I noticed that both the automations that Megan demonstrated interact with Appian, which is really neat. let's say that you have a process that needs to be automated. What factors go into deciding whether to achieve automation using Appian, UiPath, or both? So that's definitely a really good question. And I think that to kind of like take that a little bit higher level in terms of like from an RPA perspective, UiPath perspective, where does it, where would you, especially if you're integrating with a number of different systems, how would you figure out which ones you wanted to use RPA for as opposed to doing traditional integration methods? Because for sure, Appian is something that is very capable in its integration methodologies. I think that one of the things that's a deciding factor there is just ease of implementation, with the external system. All systems are going to have some, manual way of interacting with them just by nature of the fact that, that's how they got their data, in traditional methods. But if they were legacy systems and they aren't something which is, was developed with service-oriented architecture in mind, it might be that it's, a particularly difficult system to integrate with. And so, in those same scenarios, it's not going to be something which is going to change a lot, right? Like a lot of times we are trying to move away from those legacy systems. And a lot of times those are the systems that we are trying to replace with Appian. So if you're dealing with something which is a legacy system that doesn't have a good integration method, RPA can be really helpful for that. Or moreover, if you're trying to do this like, one-time big data migrations and you don't want to develop out, a huge integration with this system, which is going to be, sunset very quickly after that, that can be a big deciding factor. And then I suppose that, using Appian or UiPath or both, I think that also, just from a longevity of how long it's going to take to build out an automation versus a robust integration, it might be that you're using the automation as sort of a middle ground while you are developing out a more robust integration. And you want to get like a quick ROI, but you don't necessarily want to, and you need it, pretty, soon. So there's a couple of things that you can use in order to decide that, but it's definitely something that you can look at and try and determine, what the best option going forward is. And actually, let's see, kind of related, the next question that I see is, how long does it take for, to create automations? Like what is the development process, like timeline? And so kind of related to the last question, I guess, so for context, so Megan, can you tell us how long did it create, or how long would we expect it to, develop like the two automations that we had there?
Sure. So my team consisted of myself and two other developers. And it really does depend on how complex each automation you're dealing with is, how many different systems are you trying to integrate with, all sorts of stuff like that. But for what we demoed today, you could expect development for those two automations to take approximately a sprint each, give or take a little bit, in a sprint of 2 weeks, that is.
Gotcha. Okay. Definitely, interacting with 3 different systems, I think that traditionally that is something that's going to take a lot more time if you're doing a tradition or, a standard integration. So that's some good context. And then the final question that I have is, moving forward, how do you use UI? I'm just kind of paraphrasing a little bit, but how do you use UiPath in order to like keep moving forward, and like what's the ongoing development life cycle like? And so I think that one might be a question for Nick. Like, what are our next steps there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we are fully embracing kind of Automation Hub as the source of our ideas. And once we've kind of found a good candidate, we bring it into our, issue tracker, and we refine those ideas as development stories and conduct them much like we would any other software development that we're doing at Macedon here today. And so, we have a number of good candidates, and we're going to continue to build out these automations. For example, we have one for our SQL assistant that will allow yourself, Colin, the ability to run SQL against our database to aid in development of Appian. And so if we need some information from the database to help developers figure out some functionality, they send you over a query, you can send it to the UI assistant, and it will grab the results of the query, share them with the right parties, and they'll have the information that they need right quick.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And, we're a couple of minutes over, so I appreciate everybody who's stuck around with us for the extra couple of minutes. Thank you very much for attending. If anybody on the line has any additional questions about, just UiPath or RPA in general, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to have, a more in-depth conversation about how you would like to use it. And look forward to seeing the recording of this webinar on our website. And then we also have like a number of other webinars that we are, coming up and, continue to do. So be sure to check those out. And thank you very much for attending. Have a good one.
Thank you.